You're a failure. The words landed in front of nearly 40 people, and not one of them defended me. Not the relatives who had eaten at my table, not the business partners who had shaken my hand, and not my husband, Thomas, who sat 3 seats away and suddenly found his steak the most interesting thing in the room. That was the moment I had been waiting for, not because I wanted it, but because I was ready for it. Before I continue, I need your help reaching 1,000 subscribers. If you love shocking family betrayal and revenge stories like this, hit that subscribe button. And I'm curious, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I love knowing where my stories find you. My name is Amara Okoye. I'm 29 years old. I'm a freelance researcher. And by the end of that dinner, the woman who called me a failure would lose everything while I walked out the door with mine. But to understand how I got there, you need to understand what I found out 6 weeks earlier. Because what I discovered changed everything. The night itself started the way all of Beatrice's evenings did, with performance. The house smelled of expensive lilies and roasting lamb. Chandeliers threw cold golden light across fine china and polished silverware. Waiters in white gloves moved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Nearly 40 guests, business partners, extended family, everyone Beatrice most wanted to impress, filled the rooms in their tuxedos and diamonds, laughing the kind of laughter that costs money to maintain. I watched all of it from the edges. I didn't touch the champagne. I didn't join the circles of conversation. I just observed. Because I was the only person in that house who knew what was actually happening behind the performance, and I had been waiting for my moment. I was already seated when Beatrice stood at the head of the long mahogany table, wine glass raised, smiling like she was about to say something warm and generous. She wasn't. She looked straight at me, and she said it, honey, over a razor blade. Oh, sweetheart, you tried. We all saw you try, but let's be honest, you're a failure. The fork slipped from my fingers and hit the plate with a sharp clang. A few heads turned toward me before sliding back to her. Then came the laughter. Not loud, not cruel. Worse than that, it was polite. The kind of sound people make when they secretly agree with something and want to keep their manners clean. Thomas stared at his plate. Didn't flinch. Didn't look at me. Not once. 4 years of marriage. 4 years of staying silent while his mother dismantled me in rooms just like this one. And here we were again. Except tonight was different. I wiped my hands slowly on my silk napkin, felt the heat rise in my chest. But my hands were perfectly steady. I stood up. Every sound in the room died. I didn't look hurt. I didn't look angry. I looked calm. Patient. Like a woman who had been holding something for a very long time and had finally decided it was time to put it down. I said 3 words, check the account. Beatrice's smile held, but something behind her eyes shifted, a flicker. Just for a second. Thomas went rigid in his chair. Within minutes, this room full of 40 people would understand exactly why those 3 words had just changed everything. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the 4 years that came before it. I married Thomas believing I was walking into a partnership. What I walked into was an audition I was never going to pass. Beatrice made that clear, almost from the first week. She would compare me, casually and constantly, to the daughters of her friends. Women with Ivy League degrees, inherited wealth, the right surnames. She made cutting remarks about my job as a freelance researcher, as if finding patterns in data and turning them into insight was something to be embarrassed about. She commented on my clothes, my background, the neighborhood I'd grown up in. To her, I was a commoner who had somehow tricked her son into marriage, and she wanted everyone to know she had noticed. And Thomas, the man who was supposed to be my partner, stayed silent through every single one of those moments. That silence was its own kind of betrayal. But here's what I didn't understand yet. His silence wasn't just weakness. It wasn't just cowardice. It was fear. And I was about to find out what he was afraid of. Every family gathering followed the same script. I'd sit at the long table while they discussed real estate portfolios and overseas investments and charity galas I was never invited to. Whenever someone turned to me and asked what I was working on, Beatrice would cut in before I could speak. "Oh, Amara is still figuring things out," delivered with a wave of her hand, as though I were a confused teenager. Not a professional woman who billed 10 hours a day and built her entire career on knowing exactly how to find the truth buried in numbers. I felt caged, dependent, invisible. Thomas had taken control of our household finances in the first year of marriage, claiming his family had people for that sort of thing. And it was simply easier. He gave me a household allowance, kept me away from any account he controlled. At the time, I had accepted it. I shouldn't have. And then I started to notice things that didn't add up. Thomas would come home talking about a major promotion, then panic over a phone call at midnight. He'd say he was closing a deal in the city, but I'd find a receipt for a coffee shop 3 towns over, a detail I quietly filed away. A detail that, weeks later, my research confirmed. That coffee shop was where he'd been meeting one of his private lenders, negotiating terms he couldn't afford to discuss anywhere near home. That's when I started paying very close attention. And the more I looked, the more wrong everything became. The prestige Beatrice bragged about at every dinner table, every gala, every function, it wasn't wealth. It was theater. The lavish house, the designer clothes, the champagne and the charity galas, all of it, performance. A show running on borrowed time and borrowed money, kept alive by the sheer force of Beatrice's refusal to acknowledge that the curtain was already falling. And the man playing the lead role was terrified behind it. I just had no idea yet how terrified, or how far the deception actually went. But I was about to find out, and I wasn't at all prepared for what I discovered. It happened on a rainy Tuesday night. Thomas left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he went to shower. I wasn't a snooper by nature, but a browser tab was sitting open on his account transaction history, and when I glanced at the screen, the numbers stopped me cold. His salary had been partially garnished by a private lender. For over a year, his primary account was nearly empty. The big promotion he had been describing in proud, confident detail for months, it didn't exist. I stood there for a long moment. Then I closed the laptop, went to my office, and sat in the dark. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Not until I knew the full picture. Research was my profession, my native language, the skill I had spent years building while Beatrice dismissed it as figuring things out. I knew how to find what people tried to hide. So I started digging, quietly, methodically, late into the night, following a trail that Beatrice and Thomas believed was buried too deep for anyone to find. What I found next was worse than I expected. Thomas had been borrowing from private lenders for years, using the family's reputation and name to lure investors into business projects that were grossly misrepresented. Projects that existed more on paper than in reality. Projects that were hemorrhaging money, while Thomas kept reporting them to investors as performing well. It wasn't just poor financial management. It was fraud. I sat back from my screen, took a slow breath, and then I found something that made my blood run cold. My own inheritance. Money my grandmother had left me, which I had carefully set aside in a private account at a completely separate institution before Thomas and I had ever married, had been the only thing keeping his business account from hitting zero for the last 6 months. He had found it, accessed it without my knowledge, linked it to his business account, and had been quietly drawing from it every single month, without my consent, without a word, to cover his interest payments whenever his balance threatened to collapse. I had to read it 3 times before it fully landed. The people calling me a failure had been surviving because of me. And that's when something shifted inside me that I hadn't been expecting. I stopped feeling like a victim. For the first time in years, I could see clearly. I wasn't the weakest person in this story. I was the only one who held any real power. I just hadn't used it yet. I called my bank the very next morning, reported the unauthorized linkage. By law, Thomas could not connect my private account to his without my explicit written consent. That was fraud, plain and simple. The bank opened an investigation and placed an immediate hold on all transfers flowing out of my account into his. The drain stopped. Thomas noticed within days. I knew he would. But he couldn't confront me about it without admitting he had known about the linkage all along. So he did exactly what a drowning man does. He quietly took out a short-term bridge loan, plugged the gap just enough to survive until the dinner, and convinced himself the problem might somehow resolve itself if he could just keep the performance going a little longer. He thought he had bought himself time. He hadn't. I waited, because I knew exactly what kind of woman Beatrice was. She would never quietly retreat. She would build a stage, a grand public moment designed to elevate Thomas and put me firmly in my place one final time. And the moment she did, I'd be ready. What she didn't know was that I had already been ready for weeks. I kept digging. And the deeper I went, the darker it got. One night, I found a folder tucked at the back of Thomas's closet, behind a row of expensive suits he could no longer afford. Inside were legal notices I recognized immediately from my research. A firm was suing them for breach of contract. Thomas hadn't just lost money, he hadn't just misrepresented projects to investors. He had broken the law. And depending on how a court chose to interpret the investor communications I had now read in full, the word fraud wasn't an exaggeration. It was the precise legal term. I set the folder down. But that wasn't even the most disturbing thing I found that night. Beatrice knew. She had known for months. Tucked inside the folder was a letter in her handwriting. Calm, controlled, the careful penmanship of a woman who had managed crises before and considered herself very good at it. She told Thomas to handle it quietly. She offered to cover the first creditors using the family's emergency fund, to buy them time and keep the matter private. I set the letter down and went to find the financial statements I had already photographed weeks earlier. Because I had already seen the statements. The emergency fund was gone. Every last dollar, spent over 3 years on charity galas and designer jewelry and a summer house in the Hamptons that Beatrice used for 6 weeks a year and mentioned at every social function. She had offered Thomas a lifeline that she had already spent. Whether that was breathtaking self-delusion or cold, deliberate manipulation designed to keep Thomas compliant and grateful, I genuinely couldn't say. But it told me everything I needed to know about who Beatrice really was beneath the performance. They were both running on empty. Completely hollow. Performing a version of wealth and power that existed only in the minds of the people they were still managing to impress. And not a single person in their world suspected a thing. But I knew. I knew the bank would move on the house within 3 months. I knew the lawsuits would become public record. I knew Thomas's investor relationships were one bad quarter away from unraveling entirely. I knew their entire empire was a house of cards, and I was the only person in their circle who had done the work to understand exactly how close to collapse it really was. I gathered everything into one place. Bank statements showing the unauthorized transfers from my account, legal notices from the breach of contract suit, investor emails with misrepresentations I had documented line by line, and Beatrice's letter, the one that proved she had known, had chosen concealment, and had offered a resource she had already exhausted. One clean digital file, one drafted email, already addressed to the firm's board of directors, the primary lenders, and every key investor Thomas had courted over the last 3 years. I didn't send it. Not yet. I needed it to land in public. With witnesses in the room who couldn't later claim they hadn't seen it, hadn't heard it, hadn't been standing right there when the truth came out. Beatrice, without a single moment of awareness, was about to hand me exactly what I needed. The invitation arrived as a gold-embossed card left on the kitchen island. Beatrice was planning a massive family dinner. The occasion? Celebrating Thomas's latest promotion. A promotion I knew for a fact did not exist. Nearly 40 people. Business partners, extended family, social contacts, everyone who mattered in their world, gathered in one room, on one night, at one long mahogany table. She was handing me exactly what I needed. Thomas came home that evening and walked straight past me without looking up. "There's a dinner on Friday," he muttered, already moving toward the stairs. "Look presentable and say little. My mother wants it to be perfect." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I said quietly. He didn't hear the edge beneath those words. He was too deep in his own survival to notice. I understood exactly why Beatrice was throwing this dinner. Even with the walls closing in on every side, this was entirely consistent with who she was. Beatrice was not a woman who retreated. She doubled down, always had. In her mind, a grand, confident public display was a strategy. Shore up the investors, signal strength, silence any rumors that might be circulating. Buy Thomas more time and more goodwill with a room full of people who still believed in the family name. She had played that game her entire life, and it had always worked. But she had made a critical miscalculation this time. She didn't know about the bank hold. She didn't know the transfers from my account had stopped weeks ago. She didn't know Thomas was already quietly patching the gap with a bridge loan he had no real plan to repay. And she had absolutely no idea that I was sitting on a complete evidence file, organized, verified, and addressed, one button press away from landing in the inbox of every important person she planned to seat at her table. I spent the next 2 days not shopping for a dress, not booking a salon appointment, not preparing small talk. I sat at my desk and went through every document one final time. Every bank statement, every investor email, every legal notice, every photograph of Beatrice's letter. I checked each one against the evidence log I had built over 6 weeks of careful, quiet research. Then I opened my drafts folder. The email was ready. The evidence was attached. The names in the address line were exactly the people who needed to see it. I saved it without sending. Drafted. Armed. Waiting. I also arranged to drive myself to the dinner. I told Thomas I had an errand on the way and would meet him there. He didn't question it. He barely registered I had spoken. But some quiet, clear-eyed part of me had already made a decision I hadn't fully put into words yet. I would not be riding home with anyone that night. The morning of the dinner, I dressed simply, a plain black dress, and the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me. The same grandmother whose inheritance Thomas had been quietly stealing for 6 months. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, the only honest person in that room. When Thomas stopped by before heading over, he glanced at my outfit and frowned. "It's a bit plain, isn't it?" "It's perfect for the occasion," I said. "Trust me." I drove to the mansion alone. The house was lit like a palace, music drifting out from open windows, glasses clinking on marble surfaces. The whole elaborate performance already in motion. The trap was laid. It just wasn't for me. Beatrice found me within minutes of my arrival. She moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a woman who had hosted hundreds of these evenings and never once doubted that she was the most important person in any room she entered. She pulled me smoothly into a circle of her friends, women in evening gowns with carefully arranged expressions, and smiled in my direction. "And here is Amara. So sweet, even if she doesn't quite understand the world Thomas operates in. It must be so relaxing to have no real responsibilities." Laughter behind hands. The soft, conspiratorial kind. I didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't give her a single thing to work with. Because I knew something she didn't. And knowing it made every insult feel like nothing more than kindling she was piling around her own feet. Every word she said tonight was building the height from which she was going to fall. Thomas was across the room, standing with a cluster of investors, laughing at something one of them had said. But I noticed what no one else seemed to. His grip on his champagne glass was too tight. His laugh came a half-second too late. And his eyes, when they moved, had the fixed, scanning quality of a man mentally calculating how much longer he could hold everything together. "Not long, Thomas. Not long at all." Beatrice's eyes, meanwhile, never stopped moving either. She swept the room constantly, checking who was talking to whom, who was laughing, who had their phone out. Not the relaxed, satisfied gaze of a woman enjoying her own party. The vigilant, controlling scan of someone running a very delicate operation and monitoring every variable. She hadn't invited these people to celebrate her son. She had invited them to be managed. Every compliment Thomas received, she intercepted and folded into a narrative that centered her and diminished me. It's a lot for one man to carry an entire family's future on his shoulders, but someone has to do it. Delivered with a sigh and a glance in my direction that made the implication perfectly clear. I let it land, said nothing, smiled. At dinner, I was placed among the more distant relatives. Away from the investors, away from the inner circle, in the seat Beatrice had clearly designated as the peripheral seat. The seat that communicated, without a word, that I didn't quite belong at the real table. What she hadn't considered was the sightline that seat gave me. From where I sat, I could see every face in that room clearly and without obstruction. Every investor, every family member, every expression. I was going to need that view very soon. I ate quietly through the meal and watched Thomas. He looked like a man who had not properly slept in weeks. His face had the drawn, tight quality of someone constantly braced for impact, waiting for the moment something slipped, something was said, someone asked the wrong question. I felt a brief, involuntary flicker of something close to sadness. Then I remembered the bank statements, the inheritance, the 4 years of silence while his mother reduced me to a punchline at table after table. The sadness passed quickly. As the waitstaff cleared the main course, Beatrice rose from her chair at the head of the table. This was the moment I had been waiting for. She began her toast. Thomas's brilliance, his achievements, how he had surpassed his own father, the pillar of the community, the pride of the family name, the kind of man who carried everyone around him. And then, she turned and looked directly at me. The temperature in the room changed. People felt it. Glasses were set down. Conversations stopped. Everyone could sense that something was about to be said. They just had no idea what was actually coming. "Oh, sweetheart," Beatrice said, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. "You tried. We all saw you try. But let's be honest, you're a failure." Soft laughter rippled around the table. People looked at their plates or looked at each other. The careful, non-committal behavior of people who agree but don't want to be seen agreeing. Thomas stared at his steak. Still, silent. I let the laughter run its course. Then I stood up slowly. Every sound in that room stopped. I didn't look hurt. I didn't look angry. I didn't look like someone who had just been publicly humiliated in front of 40 people. I looked calm, deliberate, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally decided, here now in front of all these witnesses, to set it down. "Check the account." Beatrice's expression held, but something shifted behind her eyes, a micro-reaction she couldn't fully control. She covered it immediately with a short, sharp laugh. Dismissive. "Still performing. What account are you referring to, Amara? This really isn't the time or place for." "The main business account, Beatrice." I kept my voice level, clear, loud enough for every person at the table to hear without effort. "The one that's been kept alive for the past 6 months on my personal savings Thomas accessed and linked to his account, without my knowledge and without my consent." Thomas went completely still. Across the table, Mr. Henderson, a senior investor who I knew from my research held direct portal access to the firm's primary accounts as part of his investment agreement, had already unlocked his phone and was pulling up the account before I had finished the sentence. I continued. "I reported the unauthorized linkage to my bank 3 weeks ago. The bank placed an immediate hold on all transfers. What you're looking at right now, Mr. Henderson, is what that account actually holds, without my money propping it up every month." Beatrice steadied herself, adjusted her posture. "This is completely absurd. Thomas, please explain to everyone that this woman is—" "I also found the legal notices," I said, cutting straight across her. "The breach of contract suits currently filed against the firm, and a letter, written in your handwriting, to Thomas, in which you advised him to handle it quietly, and offered to pay off the first creditors from the family emergency fund." I paused for exactly 1 beat. "The emergency fund you had already spent." The room went quiet. Not the polite, social quiet of before. Something altogether different. The kind of silence that descends when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes the ground has shifted beneath them and they haven't caught up yet. Mr. Henderson looked up from his phone. His face was completely controlled. His voice was flat and cold. "The balance is as she describes." 2 other investors reached for their phones without a word. "I have the complete documentation," I said. I held up my phone. "Bank statements, legal notices, investment communications. The letter, I'm sending it now, to the board, to the primary lenders, and to the relevant parties in this room." I pressed send. 3 seconds. Beatrice reached for her wine glass and missed. It tipped sideways. Red wine spread slowly across the white tablecloth, bleeding outward like a wound that had no intention of stopping. And just like that, the performance was over. It came apart fast, and it was something to witness. Mr. Henderson pushed back his chair and stood. "This needs to be discussed," he said, looking directly at Thomas. "Tonight, before anyone leaves this house." His voice had the practiced steadiness of a man who had already begun calculating his losses and was deciding which calls to make first. Thomas tried to stand. He really did. But something in him gave way the moment he put his hands on the table. Some last support structure that had been holding him upright finally gave out, and he sank back into his chair. He looked gray, diminished, like a man watching years of carefully constructed fiction collapse in real time, and understanding there was nothing left to grab onto. The guests, who had been laughing and celebrating an hour earlier, were already reaching for their evening bags and car keys. Then Beatrice broke. She didn't break quietly. She didn't retreat with dignity, the way a woman of her supposed composure might have chosen to. She turned on me with everything she had, the full force of 4 years of contempt and the added desperation of a woman watching her entire life's performance disintegrate in front of an audience she had personally assembled. She called me a traitor, a snake, a scheming, ungrateful woman who had destroyed her family out of spite and jealousy. But here is what she failed to understand in that moment. Every word she said was another nail. Every accusation landed in front of people who had just read the documentation. Every outburst confirmed, to anyone still standing in that room, that she had known, that she had always known, that the cover-up had been as deliberate and calculated as the original fraud. The more she screamed, the more clearly she condemned herself. Thomas looked at me then, not the polite, avoidant glance I had become used to over 4 years. He really looked at me. And I could see the exact moment it all fully arrived, the understanding that I had known everything for weeks. That I had sat beside him at this very dinner table, watched him lie to investors, watched his mother perform her confidence, and said nothing. Not because I hadn't seen it, because I had been waiting for the right moment with witnesses in the room. There was fear in his face, real fear. But underneath it, something I hadn't expected to see. Recognition. Not of what I had done, of who I actually was. The woman he had quietly underestimated every single day for 4 years while his mother taught him it was safe to do so. After a long silence, he whispered, "Why?" I looked at him steadily. "Because you let her call me a failure," I said, "and you believed her." He had nothing. No answer. No defense. Nothing left to offer. The room that had been full of music and laughter was quiet now. The heavy, stunned quiet of 40 people processing something they hadn't been prepared to see. Beatrice's voice had faded behind me. The guests were leaving. The performance was over. Not because I had destroyed them. I had simply held up a mirror, and they had burned in their own reflection. I looked at the table one final time, the spilled wine still spreading, the half-eaten food, the empty chairs, the elaborate, expensive ruins of an evening that was supposed to cement their power. Then I turned toward the door. I hadn't planned to speak again. I had said what needed to be said in that room, said it loudly, with evidence and witnesses. I had no interest in a dramatic final speech. That wasn't why I had come. But 4 years of silence is a weight. And before I walked out of that house for the last time, I found I needed to put it down properly. Not for them, but for myself. One moment of truth, spoken clearly, in a room that was finally quiet enough to hold it. I turned back. Both of them were still there. Thomas in his chair, a man who looked like he had already aged a decade in the last 20 minutes. Beatrice standing near the head of the table, something in her expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not contempt, but a blankness. The face of a woman whose entire operating system had just been taken offline. For 4 years, I said, looking at both of them. I sat at tables like this one and endured your disrespect. I watched you value image over truth, appearance over people, performance over everything real. You called me a failure because I didn't fit the world you were pretending to live in, but that world was built on air, and I was the one beneath it, quietly, invisibly, holding it up. I turned to Thomas. I loved you. I genuinely did. But I understand now that you loved the version of me you could control, the version that was too dependent, too grateful, too unsure of herself to look closely at what you were actually doing. You needed me small. I paused. I was never small. You just needed to believe I was. I walked out without looking back. Through the grand foyer, past the expensive art on the walls, through the front door, and into the cool, clean night air outside. My car was waiting at the far end of the driveway, exactly where I had parked it, deliberately apart from the others. Ready. I drove away and I did not look back once. That night, I checked into a hotel, ordered room service, and slept better than I had in years. Not the restless, surface-level sleep I had grown used to in a house full of anxiety and unspoken things. Real sleep. The kind that comes when you have finally stopped carrying something that was never yours to carry. By morning, the news had started to break. The legal exposure Thomas had spent years carefully concealing was now fully on record, forwarded by people who had seen the documentation firsthand and were moving quickly to protect their own positions. The investors who had been in that room were not quiet. They had lawyers, they had interests to protect, and they were not inclined to be discreet about what they had witnessed at the dinner table the night before. Beatrice's social world. The galas, the charity committees, the carefully curated image of a family dynasty began to collapse within hours. The phone calls stopped. The invitations dried up. People who had been laughing and eating at her table fewer than 12 hours earlier were already updating the story they told about her. They'd always had doubts, they said. They'd never been that close, really. They barely knew her at all. The same people who had laughed at me across that table were now pretending they had never known her at all. I didn't feel joy in that. I want to be clear about that. I felt something quieter and more solid. Justice. Clean. Complete. Earned. I was Amara Okoye. A researcher, a daughter, a survivor, and the only person who had sat at that dinner table without a single lie holding her up. I drove toward the city. The sky was lightening ahead of me, pale gold at the edges, the kind of early morning light that makes everything look like a beginning. The dinner was over. My story was just beginning. And this time, I was the one writing it. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more shocking family betrayal and revenge stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.